Morning, everybody. Well, good morning actually here in Europe. I think it's good afternoon for all our participants in Asia and in Australia. Welcome to the first series of webinars hosted by The Great Indoors, powered by Target. My name is Marjolein Verleg. I am the EMEA Marketing Communications Manager for Target for the segments Workplace and Hospitality. TheGreatIndoors.eu is an online platform powered by Target to inform and to inspire the ever-evolving workplace conversation and help create healthy, flourishing workspaces. And in the wake of COVID-19, we're launching an exciting new webinar series called Rethinking a Workplace, drawing on Target's own extensive research around the wants and needs of office workers around the globe, both pre and post COVID-19. Because, and I think you will all agree with me, that there's a lot of discussion about the role the office will be going forward. As well as presenting our own findings, the Rethinking Workplace webinar series will also bring together insights from key industry experts around the world. And today we bring you Hannah Nardini, workplace strategist and managing director of WKspace in London. And Hannah will share insights from her global research, exploring how both employee and employer attitudes towards the office have changed and continue to change in the aftermath of COVID-19. So over to you in London, Hannah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh, could you just pass me screen sharing? Sorry, it said it's...
Oh.
Okay, let me give... No.
Not share the screen?
No, it's saying it's disabled.
It is disabled.
Technical glitch, everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just check. This is, hang on there. We will just have to find out how that works. Are you able to share it now?
Let's have a look. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
I can, right. Okay. Can you see my screen? Does that come up? And just going to minimize that down. Okay, so let's go into that. Sorry about the delay. Hopefully you've got my screen on view. If you haven't, if you could give me a shout. So yes, I'm Hannah Nardini, and we've been working as workplace strategists and behaviour change managers now for nearly 25 years. And some interesting things have happened with workplace, and we started to run a load of surveys starting on the 30th of March. We were interested to see the impact that COVID-19 was going to have on the world of work. Without a doubt, this has been a phenomenal shift in how we operate, how we think about work, how we think about workplace. And we were keen initially, just our own perspective really, to understand how we would need to evolve as a business. But we started to learn some really interesting sort of insights from people as we started to doing it, and it grew legs. And before you know it, we were running weekly surveys, and we're still continuing to do that. So some of the data I'm going to share with you is very much updated. So the last survey that we've included in part of this data set is right up until the 20th of August. We do use a number of different platforms to launch our surveys. Some of them are through paid responses so that we could get a true independence, and others are just through working with our own client base. As you can see from locations, we are running surveys globally, so these are just a snapshot of some of the locations that we're working in right now. And what I'm going to do today is focus very much on kind of the APAC data that we have to make it a little bit more relevant to yourselves. So let's make a start. Let's think about employees for a moment and how they're feeling. So security of their jobs. We've been tracking this since the beginning, and at the beginning people weren't that concerned. I think as the pandemic deepened, suddenly the anxiety and concern that's going around job security has also heightened. So as of the 20th of August, the data that we were reflecting there was that 43% of people are actually really concerned about their job security. There are some people who are saying, actually, I'm just not concerned at all. We do tend to find that the biggest layer of concern is coming from Generation Z and Generation X. So Generation Z are your youngest of generations. They're the ones who are starting off on the career ladders and maybe finding that opportunities aren't there so much. But also amongst Generation X, who are kind of that 35 to 50-year-old-ish kind of age range, likely at the point of looking for promotion opportunities. They've probably got mortgages, there'll be families that they need to consider, and there's particularly heightened anxiety amongst that particular generation. As far as the employers though, we were interested to see from an employer perspective, were they reading people properly? And we don't think they're a million miles off, to be honest. 56% of employers reported that they do feel that their employees are concerned about their jobs. And that has definitely changed and developed maybe some of the communication that they were running with them. We've also been tracking something called the PSS scale, which is the perceived stress scale. We've been using the 4-point system as opposed to the 10 or the 14-point. And you may be familiar with this as a psychological scale. It's an official measure of stress. Now, we've been running this across our surveys just to track where people are. We have tended to note that the youngest of the generations, so if we look at your millennials and your Gen Zs, are showing particularly higher levels of stress. And that is consistent for us, no matter whereabouts in the world you are. It's come out exactly the same. We do know as generations, they tend to be sitting with slightly higher anxiety and stress levels than maybe some of the older generations. We're also seeing that the younger generations learn coping mechanisms by actually being around their colleagues. They'll just watch and observe how people deal with certain situations. And during lockdown, we've actually missed that. They haven't been present to observe how other people are dealing or coping with situations. So there's a definite gap emerging maybe in some of the psychological well-being side. But as you can see from this chart, just looking at a snapshot of some of the countries and how they're scoring, some countries are definitely showing much higher stress levels than others. We do know from our research across India, for example, and the Philippines, there's been a lot of challenges around physical connectivity. We can't also ignore the fact that the impact of COVID in some countries has been much more excessive than in others. And that definitely does start to come to play a little bit in how people are feeling. But as far as workplace related, there are some issues that are causing some frustrations for people who are working maybe in a different way in some of the more developing countries. So we will continue to monitor that. So generally, how are people feeling working from home? And this is kind of the Asian Pacific data bolted together. On the whole, we're interested to see whether the experience now is better, the same, or worse than it was in the beginning. We ran a webinar series at point number 2, which was called Has the Novelty Worn Off? And we did start to see it plateau out a little bit, where at the beginning people were really excited and this is a really great opportunity and I'm loving doing this. And as the weeks progress, suddenly people are thinking, actually, I really just miss the office. I'm missing people. And sure enough, we've started to note that, yes, there are some people, 13%, who are saying, I'm definitely not enjoying it as much as I was in the beginning. For 39%, it's settled into it's kind of about the same, and they've found their rhythm and their routine. But 48%, they're actually saying they're enjoying it more than they did in the beginning. There was a lot of skeptics at the beginning, or people who maybe hadn't worked from home a lot previously, and they've become converts. Suddenly they've found a way of operating. Now, at the beginning, there was quite a high proportion of those people saying, I'm really not enjoying this experience. As time has gone on, it's actually reversed, and they're the ones now who are saying, actually, I'm really enjoying this, and I can see myself doing this much more over the longer term. How do I feel about other aspects? Motivation is a big thing. So we've been tracking motivation. It's pretty much held good. It started at about 43%. We're now on 56. Again, people have just found their routines that have become a natural part of their working lives. So they do generally feel quite motivated. Productivity is an interesting one as well. People generally are saying, the majority are saying, that they feel more productive working from home than they did in the office. Now, there is about 30% of people who are saying they're absolutely not more productive and they would prefer to be in the office. The question relating to this is very much dependent on task, which we will touch on in a moment. Different tasks are having different levels of productivity, and whether that's at home or in the office, we'll explore that in a moment because we've been asking that in a little bit more detail. Asking about team connection, so a little bit around the team morale, the bond, the culture that exists within a team. Generally, 38% are feeling that it hasn't been affected. There's definitely been extra effort put in to communicate with teams to make sure that everybody feels engaged. That is demonstrated. However, people feel that maybe it's just not quite the same. Running things virtually, it has missed out on a little bit of the social side. So people tell us that they jump onto calls and they get straight into the call. They're not really engaging on a personal level or a more of a social side. It's very much functional and for a purpose. There's a definite sort of social bond there that is weakening slightly. And 59% report that they're actually feeling less stress working from home, which is great. What was good to see on the PSS scale is the scale suggests that anything below 7 means that people are in low stress. And it was good to see that most people are in a really good place to deal with that. If we started to see that creep into sort of ranges of 7+, starts to show moderate to high stress, and that's where we would suggest that companies start to put interventions in place. On the whole, things are looking good globally. So a little bit of a snapshot. If we take all of these positive experiences and bolt it together and run it into what we call an overall experience score, what we're starting to see here is how each country has experienced this. Some countries better than others, as you can see. So Spain is having an amazing time. They are flying. They've loved this whole experience. It's opened their eyes into wanting to work from home more frequently, whereas Italy, on the other hand, you'll notice is the other end of the extreme. As a nation, we know that they've been particularly hit hard with COVID, particularly in the early days. We also know that the infrastructure is not necessarily as great, so productivity has definitely been impacted slightly there. We're also noting that it's quite a sociable country, so the thoughts of being into lockdown and quite an extreme lockdown, they've missed the social connection. The one thing they've struggled with is getting time management under control, so work-life balance has gone out of kilter quite significantly for some locations. So that's sort of explaining the two key extremes there. Generally across places like India and the Philippines, it was far better received than we were expecting it to be. A lot of the time people didn't actually work from home. They also told us that they had probably one of the worst ergonomic setups. They didn't really have the right environment to do it, but nevertheless, people have really appreciated the opportunity to spend more time with families. So we're hearing a lot about stressful commutes, particularly in those areas, and the amount of time that people can take to actually get into the office, and gaining that time back has been incredibly valuable to people. So it's an experience that we're likely to see retained in a lot of different countries, and particularly in your own regions. It's something that we're likely to see continuing going forward as a pattern. I have been interested though to understand hours worked and extra hours worked I'm referring to here versus productivity. There's quite an interesting correlation starting to emerge. Without a doubt, people are working longer hours. We're typically seeing the average at about 55% of people are saying they're working more hours now than they were previously. And the people aren't quick to complain about it. What they're generally saying is, instead of doing the commute, I get up and I start working earlier, which is fine, but we just know that that's not sustainable as a model. There will come a point where people start to burn out. There are also health benefits coming with this, which we will touch on in a moment. But what's quite interesting is the correlation between working more hours and people's perception of how much more productive they are. At the moment, the data is tending to suggest that people are more productive working from home because they are working more hours. And we're analysing it a little bit deeper. It's just started to emerge as a pattern, so I thought I'd share that with you very early on. So check back in with us to see how that levels out. But if you are working hours and longer hours, it does make sense that your productivity would be improved. But actually, is the true effects of this from working from home or just the hours? So open questions on this one. So virtual meetings, where are we at with virtual meetings? It's become a natural part of our life, and 78% of people report that these have been really successful. However, 66% are also reporting that they feel it doesn't build a meaningful relationship with the client. What we're starting to realize and learn, and particularly through certain sectors, most notably the legal sector, that client relationships, they feel, are better initially conducted in person. So it's estimated that the first 3 meetings that are held with a new client would be better done in person, where you can genuinely get a gauge of a person. You can start to build a little bit more of a personal relationship and a rapport. And at that point, they feel generally it's acceptable that you can switch that across to a virtual meeting if that is appropriate to do so. So early signs that there are still a place for in-person meetings. So how do people feel that the client relationship has changed? And again, we've had to wait for a little bit of time on this one to see how this kind of has settled out. Reassuringly, it's good to see that around 51% of people are saying it hasn't really been damaged. It's around the same. 25% are reporting is actually improved. So there are some really good positive signs that maybe this hasn't had such a damaging impact after all for some of our relationships, particularly with external clients. There are 18% who are saying, yes, it has had a negative impact on it. And again, we will continue to monitor this and start to develop that thinking a little bit further. So what about the workplace? How important is the workplace to you now? And this has been interesting because it really has settled over the past 2 months, and we're not really seeing a significant shift away from this. There's about 30% of people who just say, I just want to get back. The minute you open it, I'm there. And they also correlate to the people who have been less productive and less happy working from home. We know that if you display more extroverted characteristics, you rely and thrive in an environment where it's busy and you're around other people. The extroverts have taken everything around working from home and lockdown and isolation a lot harder than their introverted colleagues who have loved the experience. In fact, what we find is the overall experience score for an extrovert has come out around 51%, as opposed to 97% for the introverts. You can start to understand a little bit of the magnitude of the differences here. The office is essential for certain people. If you are displaying more extroverted characteristics, and if your staff are in that particular kind of trait, then you will expect to have attendance in the office. Whereas introverts they're just happy in their own company. They can work very independently and they can thrive in isolation. So for them, it doesn't mean that they're antisocial or unfriendly. They do still want to go back into the office and connect. But what we do realise is the introverts were the least happy about the workplace at the beginning. They felt that it was too noisy, there were too many distractions, I can't concentrate here. The extroverts were less complaining about that. What we're seeing is 2 extremes here, and neither of them are correct. Just solely working in an office is great if you are extroverted characteristics, but not if you're so much on the introverted side. And equally, just working from home is great for the introverts, but it's not so great for the extroverts. What we're looking for here is the creation of balance between the two, giving people perhaps autonomy, empowerment and control over how and where they're actually working. And what we're seeing from this particular data set is there's 13% of people, and that's pretty much hovered around between 13 and 15%, who no longer believe that you actually need an office. They feel that everything could be done virtually. Early on during lockdown, a lot of companies sprung up and said they were getting rid of their offices for good. We are noticing there's a lot of U-turns happening right now. So we'll continue to monitor this to see how this one settles. But the office is not disappearing anytime soon. We asked employers, let's think a little bit about the employer experience. We wanted to understand a little bit about the value of the workplace to them regarding their vision and their purpose. Do they feel that it's essential to have that? And as you can see from this, 84% of them do believe that having a physical environment is essential. And again, employers are very important because they're the decision makers regarding what happens with real estate going forward. So they also kind of agree that there is an essential need to have the workplace. So what about wellbeing? We're going to touch on wellbeing again at a moment as an emerging issue, but generally 47% feel that this has actually been improved. And by wellbeing, we're referring to this as your physical, mental and emotional health. For 30%, it hasn't really changed, it's remained the same, but for 23%, it's actually had a very negative impact. We are starting to see that this is not just generational. This is across all generations that are starting to experience maybe some of the negative impact of just solely working from home. What does it mean for employment going forward? Well, for 41%, they're not really going to be wanting to have a job where they're traveling internationally, at least in the short term. And 66% say that they would prefer to have a job where they can at least walk to it, cycle, or maybe drive their own vehicle to the office. People are having a little bit of aversion away from public transport and the potential risks that that presents. There's a lot of high anxiety and concern about returning to the office, particularly not so much the people individually at high risk categories, but maybe the contact they have within their families is their greatest concern, who are in high risk groups, and maybe bringing something back into the family home is a concern to people. But working from home has been such an important, integral part of what people have learned this year. 31% of people tell us they would consider changing jobs if their employer turned around to them now and said that they weren't able to work from home. It'll be interesting to see how this one plays out over time. Obviously, let's not forget there is concern and anxiety about job security. So we're not likely to necessarily see this coming through in the short term, but over the longer term, this is likely to be an expected demand. And 46%, interestingly, will judge an employer on how they've treated people. We're now at a point of social media. We have things like Glassdoors. There's loads of platforms that people or employees can share their experiences, and they are certainly sharing. It's always important, we advise our clients to always look at what's been said and what's been discussed externally to your organisation. People will look at that, and particularly the newest of the generations that you are looking to attract. They will look at external reviews and take a steer from their peers as to whether it's worth even attending an interview in that particular company. So how you treat people right now is important. This will come back and potentially haunt some companies. So asking employees a little bit more specifically, let's think to a time post-pandemic and either therapeutic cure or vaccination programs. What do you think your preferred working pattern might be? And this has really started to settle out. We're not really seeing much shift in this. And again, this is very much based around your own data. What we're starting to see is the most popular response, about 25% of people saying 3 days at home and 2 days in the office. And that is pretty consistent in most locations. There's only 5% of people saying that they would like to solely work in the office. Now, there are some people who don't have the infrastructure for it. Some people just don't want to work from home. They're not effective there. What we're starting to see, though, again, as we mentioned previously, is the balance. People want the best of both worlds, not extremes. But there are 20% saying that they would be quite happy to mostly work from home and maybe visit the office once or twice a month. If you were to look at this in a controlled way and schedule so that not everybody turns up on the same day, we looked at a balanced occupation across a week's period. You're looking at about 38% of employees being in the office at any given point. That is presenting a huge amount of opportunities to look at how you are occupying your space and how much space do you really need. So this is starting the dialogue. For people who are expecting to work from home, and legislation does vary wildly between countries, we asked employees what they felt was an appropriate approach towards this. 38% of employees were expecting that if they are going to be working from home more regularly, the employer should be compensating them for added costs. So things specifically around heating, maybe a strengthened broadband or Wi-Fi and electricity costs. There is also a natural expectation that they would be supplied with equipment. There's only 7% of employees saying that they didn't expect remuneration. This is actually quite important because if you are looking to encourage maybe more flexibility in future and more working from home, this is a cost that has to be counted. So yes, you may be able to save money on real estate, but there will be an added cost of supplying the right type of equipment and setup for employees. Asking people when they go back into the office, be it short-term or long-term, let's think about management of touch points. Touch points are things where they're potentially going to come into contact with the virus. And what we started to look at is some of these key areas that all of you will have in your workplace, and just test out where people sit on these matters. Across the board, people have learned to cope without their filing cabinet and without their printer. They've had to find digital ways of getting around some of these issues. Now, for some people, that's been really challenging, but there's only 9% of people who are telling us that. So when we talk about going back into the workplace and thinking about all of the things that people are potentially touching and that hygiene hazards, it was really reassuring to see that people are happy to let them go. So there's a definite desire to potentially reduce some of these down. Can you use this as an opportunity to get rid of at least 50% of your filing? Filing locks up floors and it locks down people. If we can look at freeing up space and freeing people by using more digital retrieved methods, it would be far more effective. Same with printing. If we're looking to reduce our storage, it makes sense to reduce our printing so that we're not actually encouraging an increase in storage. This is an opportunity for you to potentially look at a 50% reduction in your copy facility. Look at rationalisation, consolidation, try and lock these together into central locations. Shared stationery. People do like to keep their own stash. And we're just trying to think of kind of people moving around a space much more free. They don't want to be carrying stuff around, but equally sharing stationery is not great either. It makes sense that if we are looking to reduce paper generally, this naturally would also reduce. And at least in the short term, shared mugs or cutlery or crockery, so plates, people are keen to perhaps remove those for now. Maybe look at more disposable products, but don't forget the environmental impact. People are much more environmentally aware. 82% of people are telling us that they would like to be much more environmentally minded, and they're expecting their employers to be the same. So just think about any temporary or disposable products that you do put in, of just the sustainable aspects to each of those. Also thinking short term, how do we maintain the office and the hygiene within it? You've been gifted this golden opportunity to go for a clear desk policy. In change management, it's one of the things that we take longest trying to transition people through. People are willing to give up certain things right now in the interests of maintaining the space. So when there's a lot of clutter and personalization at a desk, it's hard to clean it. And people understand that. So 92% were in support of clear desk policies. And interestingly, 71% are in support of not eating at desks, particularly in the survey when we explain how germs and bacteria are often triggered by food dropping into keyboards that maybe don't get cleaned out as much as other aspects of the office. So people were quite supportive of the idea of perhaps not eating in those spaces so that the hygiene can be maintained. It's also good from a social angle. Obviously, we have to think about social distancing spaces, but having the opportunity to at least chat or talk to other people in a safe environment will be important to people. It's one thing that they're telling us they've missed. As far as housekeeping rules, 82% are fully in support of a housekeeping rule. Protocols that say this is the behaviour that we expect of each other. There's a general fear that there are some people in the workplace who will not follow any of the protocols that you're setting out. And to be honest, in our survey, there's 18% of people admit that they don't intend to follow any rules. This can be challenging. So some organisations are considering behavioural contracts that actually insist that there are consequences if they're not followed. It is important for the well-being of yourselves and each other that these are very carefully managed. So actually starting to think about how you're going to enforce that and almost encourage people to be following these rules are important, which is why we've been asking the question about housekeeping, and it's got a lot of support. So we asked employers to tell us a little bit about their experiences over the past few months. What have they been doing? How effective have they been? So I just wanted to share a little bit of a dashboard summary of maybe what employers are doing right now. 43% of them have told us that they've been running regular engagement surveys. We're hearing a lot about pulse surveys that are going out, asking how people are feeling. If you're doing that, continue to do that, continue to check in. If you haven't started that yet, we encourage you to actively start just talking and communicating. It's nice to see that the impact on culture has dropped. It was at 43%. It's now gone down to 18% of employers feeling that their culture has been negatively impacted. A lot of the time they're feeling that they've actually found a way around things, which has been great to see. Only 32% though previously were experienced in managing employees on outputs only. One of the biggest learning curves that managers have had is managing a virtual team and measuring what's being produced, measuring productivity and measuring output. A lot of the culture that existed was built around presenteeism and the thoughts of having to see somebody to think that they're working. That has changed. People have had to find a way around this, and it's moved much more into a trusting culture, which is great to see now that 68% of employers have told us that they will allow employees to have more control. They will give them a little bit more trust and freedom and autonomy to perhaps make decisions over how and where they are working. But on the whole, 79% believe that people have adapted relatively easy. So there's a lot of positive signs coming through from employers. We've asked them as well about business performance. So asking performance and productivity, two different things. So performance we see more as the kind of cooperation between the teams and the individuals within the organisation, just to kind of pull together and get stuff done. On the whole, a bit of a mixed bag, 40% saying it's improved and 45% saying it's actually decreased. Sorry for my spelling there. 15% are feeling that actually it's been around the same. But how does this relate to performance and productivity? So in productivity terms, actually 35% are saying that their business productivity has improved. It's actually increased during lockdown. And 30% are saying it's stayed the same. What we're looking at there is 65% are saying that their business productivity is the same or better, which I think from an economic perspective is really positive early signs that maybe the impact of this may not be felt as deep with some employers as maybe we originally anticipated. But asking employers more specifically about their real estate, what do you think is going to happen to your office? There is a wide range of ideas on this. For 15% of people, they're telling us that they think they need more space. A lot of the thought here is driven around the short-term social distancing. If we're going to get more people back into the office, it stands to reason we need more space because of the amount of distance that we need between people to manage it effectively. There is a smaller percentage of people going on that thinking. The majority of employers that we're talking to are opening the office, but it's on a flexible arrangement where people are free to come and go as they want to. It needs to be controlled because there's kind of occupation limits as far as how many people are allowed in the space. Generally, what we're experiencing with our own clients is they're not really intending on bringing everybody back for the foreseeable future. We've got some clients talking around autumn of next year. There's very few talking actually about this year as their primary target. So what instead they're doing is they're engaging with us to think about what their long-term real estate strategy is going to look like. What do we need to be doing in 2 years' time, 5 years' time? What does our real estate look in 10 years' time potentially? So we're doing a lot of analytics and survey work around actually exploring what workplace could mean for them and what that might mean for their workplace. On the whole, though, 55% are generally feeling that they're not going to need as much space. If the office isn't opening in the short term or in the longer term, they see that working from home is going to be a way forward, and therefore the impact that will have on the workplace will be quite significant. So let's start to look a little bit about work a little more specifically and the tasks that people are performing. So we asked employees a few different areas. So one thing that we used to learn before COVID from our engagement is people felt that they had to be sat right next to their team because that's how work happens. That's no longer true. And people are managing to connect with their teams virtually. They've found a way around it. So for 59% of people, they're now telling us, actually, I don't have to be around my colleagues. It's nice to be around them for maybe 1 day a week where we can catch up. We've got a good relationship. It would be great to overhear what's going on. But other than that, I don't actually need to do that. That is opening up opportunities. We're also seeing that people have started to challenge their conventional thinking on what a private meeting actually means. It's now quite commonplace for people's families to interrupt calls. You'll see people walk past, there's pets. We've started to just accept that meetings are done differently. And sometimes you could be having quite a private or sensitive conversation, and you can have things going on around you in the background. People have started to really challenge their thinking around what is actually private. Some things, yes, they do need to be done in more of a secure and private way. But a lot of the time, people are realizing that actually their conversation isn't private, and I can do that in a more informal setting. Just think about the opportunity that presents to you regarding meeting space and how that is configured. Do you need to have as much built environment as you had previously? And 70% are telling us that they want to have control. Now, it was reassuring to see that employers, 68% of employers were saying that they will give their people freedom to make those choices. And 70% of employees are telling us they want that. So that will be important in future. Asking people then more specifically about tasks, and this is linking back to the productivity conversation we had right at the very beginning. Some people are highly productive working from home, but it depends on the task. So asking people, thinking about key things that you are probably engaging with in a week, where do you think you'd be better performing those tasks? Concentrated working, this is individual focus time. Estimated that around 65% of your week is spent in concentrated activity. 70% of employees tell us that they would prefer to do that at home. So they're in much more control of their environment. There's less noise and distractions, particularly if you are in an open plan office. There's 27%, which correlates to people who are saying it was essential to have the office, and the ones who are saying, I desperately want to get back. They still want to go back to the office to do those tasks. But on the whole, we're seeing things like work-related phone calls, so the ability to make private phone calls, the ability to focus and concentrate are more home-based tasks. But what we're likely to see is the purpose of the office change. People tell us that they would like to do more team working or collaboration, go to the office for a purpose to work with other people. And it's likely that the office will be the go-to place for that, 65%. And equally meetings, we're starting to see the shift in people feeling that meetings are mostly better done in person. There are some meetings that we can do virtually, but nevertheless, in-person meetings, particularly the client meetings that we mentioned, would be good if they were done in person. And socializing, even though you can have a virtual coffee, it's just not quite the same. 68% of people feel that going into the office, maybe even if it's just to catch up with people and have lunch with them or socialize, is an important dynamic. What we're likely to see is the office be engineered more around collaboration, meetings, and socializing, and maybe less about focus. You still need some of that, but maybe it will be less of a dominant space than it has been previously. Asking employees, therefore, if you were to work from home more, is it not fair and reasonable to say that you could be sharing space? Now, there's a lot of anxiety around this. A lot of people get concerned. It inherently evokes a lot of emotion at the thoughts of taking a desk off somebody. But if we just think this through, that's a lot of real estate costs to be locked up when you have people working potentially 3 days a week at home. And you can see generally 64% of employees are supportive of that approach, but it does need to be well managed. And we stress that quite specifically. We need to think about transfer of germs and hygiene and all of these other factors. But let's not forget, people are happy to do clear desk policies and are happy to not be eating at desks. With that thinking, if you could start as you mean to go on, this is something that your organisation could naturally start to evolve into. And you as an organisation would start to get the benefits from it over the longer term, particularly when it looks at cost and real estate. There are 20% of people who are unsure, to be expected at this point. 16% outright no, I absolutely do not want to be doing that. And that is what change management is for. It's to support everybody through into a transition of perhaps working in different ways. So when we started to explain a little bit more about activity-based working, and a lot of you are probably familiar with this concept, modern workplace design is built around the fact that being in one set spot is not the most effective way to be working, and the research supports that. Open plan is probably one of the most disruptive places if you need to concentrate. You have a cycle of distraction every 3 minutes, it's estimated, to one of your senses, but it takes you 23 minutes to get into focus. So if you really need to get something done, it's not the place to be. So looking at activity-based working models, this is about aligning space to a particular task, and it would include a variety of spaces. It would be phone spaces, virtual meeting spaces. It will be silent workspaces so that you don't want to be interrupted. You move to a different way. And we started to explain to people a little bit about what activity-based working was. And then we asked them, how do you feel about that? What was good to see is 16% are already doing it, and 55% feel, yeah, I can absolutely do that, providing hygiene is managed properly. Same reasons as desk sharing or hot desking. 24% of people were feeling generally, and it's to be expected, we typically expect about 20% of people to have anxiety about this, it won't work for me. We do appreciate there are some tasks that can't be operating in this way. So for example, a reception task, you can't have someone who's meant to be manning a reception wandering around the office sitting in other areas. So there are certain tasks quite logically would not be necessarily practical for that. However, reassuring signs, people are prepared to consider it. And now is the time that if you are thinking about transforming your workplace, now is the time to start thinking about it. There's some great habits that have emerged and behaviours that are starting to come through. Work with that and see where that takes you in the longer term. What features are important to people? This is quite interesting because it's almost like going back to the basics. And we often refer to Maslow, a Maslow hierarchy of needs you may have heard about. And it's become that. It's less about the gimmicks and it's more about, I just want a space that's got good light, natural daylight, comfortable temperature. My chair's comfortable. I've got freedom to move. People are reversing and they're rebelling against lockdown. Anything that's about you will sit there and you will do this. People inherently are starting to move away from that concept. They're less comfortable with it. So people are looking for a workplace that gives them the basics. It's less about perhaps having on-site catering. It's more about self-catering. So making sure that people are in a position to look after themselves. So more specifically, what type of spaces do they want? What we'll start to notice here is point number 6, the demise of the open plan. Open plan still has its place and its role, but people are starting to realise in comparison to focusing at home, which is where they're telling us they feel they would be most effective for the majority, open plan has its flaws and people are starting to realise and perhaps panic about the thoughts of going back to the office into this big, vast open space. What we're seeing is more emphasis around focus. If I am coming into the office, I don't want my productivity to waver. Therefore, I need to be able to concentrate without being interrupted. I want to be able to shut myself away. I need visual privacy because I don't necessarily want to be interrupted visually from people. So we started to see the emergence of more of these other types of focus spaces. It's not about returning to the cubicles or going back into highly cellularized offices. It's about managing it in a slightly more strategic way. We could look at introducing things like a library. So the rules, no phones, no talking, don't interrupt me if I'm sat in there. It's a smallish space that seats maybe 6 to 8 people. It's efficient. It might be a hot office, a very small, compact room that you can shut the door and you can work. It may be that 2 of you can come together and work. It might be open plan that just has slightly higher visual privacy to certain banks of desks. But let's not forget, open plan is good for collaboration. So we don't want to be shutting it off too much, and it still has its place, but we need to get it in a good sense of perspective. How much of your real estate is assigned to open plan? As far as collaboration, this is one of the key reasons that people said they would come into the office, which is why the percentages sit higher. But spaces where you can just spread out, almost project work areas. It's big benches, it's areas that you can just come, grab your laptop, sit for maybe an hour or 2 with your colleagues and work together. It's not about a meeting, it's about really working as part of a team format. Spaces where you can just chat to people and you're not going to have people telling you to be quiet or shush, or I'm trying to do something, or I've got a phone call going on. How do you facilitate the casual collision? And it's often around things off navigation corridors that enable people to just drop and come together and have a quick 5-minute chat and then move away. Let's not forget, that's the one thing that people tell us they miss. So how are you going to facilitate that purposefully in your workplace? And challenge the meeting concept. So things like sofa pods and booths, informal meeting spaces. Meetings don't always have to now be in a room, but there's a lot of virtual meetings going to be happening, and there's no point having a 10-person meeting room with 1 person sat in it. So think about these smaller spaces that people can drop into and use. And then on social and wellbeing, Outdoor seating. If you've got outdoor seating spaces, make the most of it. It's very highly sought after. People just want to be able to be outside. The one thing they've said, depending on the country you're in, during lockdown, people have enjoyed just, if it's nice weather, just going outside for lunch, eating outside, going for a walk. People have appreciated nature and the simple things in life. And how are you going to replicate that? Spaces where people can just disconnect from technology, just take that moment to be on their own is important, but also spaces where they can come together. Dining spaces features at number 4. The ability to just socialize. The one thing they're missing is connection. Provide spaces that encourage it. Don't forget, people are happy to not eat at their desks. So how are you going to facilitate that in a different way? We're seeing perhaps less demand for more of the gaming spaces and more in favor of the socializing spaces. So if we start to kind of conclude and what does all this potentially look like, we're starting to see the workplace built around key zones. Now, collaboration sits really as a flexible space between focus and meetings. It's a fluid, dynamic space that is either a work area or is a team meeting area, or it's spreading stuff out, it's project working. We need to think about how that is perhaps accommodated. We're likely to see maybe 30% of the real estate instead of 70% locked up with focus. So some of it will be open plan, but it will be things like private workrooms, silent libraries. Meeting spaces are likely to be less around the larger meeting rooms, more around smaller spaces, but technology is everything. Digital connections. So making sure that people can connect virtually no matter where they are into a space and communicate with people effectively. And social is becoming more important. So we're likely to see the rise of social meeting and collaboration spaces, maybe a decrease in the amount of focus space. And all of this kind of leads into what the workplace purpose potentially is, which is around a community. You're going there for a purpose. So people are looking at flexible working and home working policies, and the workplace becomes a destination. And therefore it needs to be designed to support the needs that people have when they're there. But let's not forget the basic fundamental need that we all have as human beings, which is around the theory of proxemics. It's the need for personal space. We don't want to be doing is shoehorning and cramming people together. So just think about flexing boundaries, breathing space. People don't want to be crammed in. So really focus on that in the long term, not just in the short term in social distancing. This is a long-term need and it's a given in any workplace. So some trends that are going up. Flexibility. Definitely people want to be able to work from home in future, but within balance, not extremes, as we mentioned. So think about policies that enable that. Wellbeing is going to become more important to people. So thinking about how as an employer you're going to layer that in, what mental health and physical health support you're going to give people. Flexibility around spaces. It's about activity-based working, it's variety. What COVID has done is fast-tracked us towards activity-based working. It's not actually introduced a complete revolutionary new things in that regard as far as workplace. It's actually moved us closer to this autonomous position of activity-based working. You just align the space to the task. Digital connection is absolutely vital. There are people who will now be connecting in. You might have workers geographically dispersed. We need to think about these connection points. So we're seeing the rise of technology. Smarter use of space. If people are going to be working from home, people have told us that they're happy to negotiate on that and share space when they are in the workplace. That opens up opportunities for you to perhaps look and rationalize your real estate. Another area that we've seen emerging, which is why I've included it here, is inclusivity and parity of experience. What we don't want to do is go back to the old days of 3 people, 4 people sat in a meeting room and someone or maybe 2 people dialing in who feel they're missing out, they're disconnected, they're not as engaged because they're not in the room. A lot of organisations we're now working with are saying that if there's people dialing into a meeting, then you all have to dial in and nobody together into a meeting room. So if there's no one coming together virtually, then of course go and use one of the meeting spaces and do that in person. But to make sure that there is not this overlooking of people working from home or almost a second-class citizen, there's a definite desire to think about this inclusivity experience. So something to consider going forward. Trends going down, presenteeism. People have told us they will leave their jobs if they feel that they're not given the flexibility. Just think about the culture. You've done a lot of work of getting trust, flexible cultures in place. You're starting to measure on outputs. Let's work with that. Let's not go back to a very inflexible culture. Residential design, which is this combination between residential and commercial furniture kind of solutions. There's a definite trend away from it. People have spent months working from home, and their general thoughts to us is, why do I want to go into the office and it looks like my home? I'd rather just go to the office and it feels like an office. So maybe a change in design aesthetic coming through there. Large expanse of open plan, we're definitely seeing the demise of that, and more increase in more focused, concentrated spaces. Unnecessary meetings. People are admitting that they're spending significantly longer on Teams calls or Zoom calls, and it's locking into their days, it's extending their work days. People just want to get a little bit more control over that. And long inflexible leases. The desire is for 2 to 3 year lease agreements as opposed to 5 to 10 year lease agreements. So we definitely see from an employer perspective a shift from the longer term leasing. I just want to finally, before we finish, just touch on some emerging issues that we've noticed coming through, particularly in the past month. These are things that we're starting to notice and get mooted to us from client surveys and our own surveys. People have been less physically active. Now, this does link to well-being. People have just kind of become very sedentary. That in the long term is going to present us with some problems. So let's start to think about what we're going to do about that now. Are there measures you could put in place in the workplace, or incentives? Are there accredited schemes that you could participate in that get people moving? So let's just think about what that might mean. That has resulted in some weight gain. I think there's a fair proportion of us have probably experienced that. But what is interesting, aches and pains. So how many people have ergonomic setups? 23% are reporting backache. What we don't want to see is significant issues from your employees coming forward because they weren't provided with the right kind of kit. Start thinking about this now if you haven't already. We've also noticed eyesight has got worse. Opticians are saying that they're incredibly busy right now because people are sitting in front of screens for a lot longer. They're not taking breaks. Think about putting some measures in place that encourage people to take regular breaks away from technology. That even includes the phones. Just move away, do something completely different and go back to task. Think about people's individual well-being now going forward. And general just joint aches, people complaining about wrist pain. Again, thinking about the ergonomics. Are they using a separate keyboard and mouse, or are they using laptops? Are they kind of bending forward rather than looking at a bigger monitor? There are a potential number of emerging issues coming through here that we just want you to be aware of. Just keep an eye on. So in conclusion, old habits do die hard. We've been working this way. The culture of the way that we operate in the workplace has been around for nearly 300 years, and the 9 to 5 in particular has been around since the 1800s. There have been a lot worse pandemics in history, and they didn't change the workplace. So it's kind of a word of, is this pandemic enough to change things? It remains to be seen. The difference we have in this pandemic, though, over every other one, is our digital connectivity. We are suddenly able to work in a different way, and previous pandemics necessarily didn't have that in place. So we need to see how this is actually going to evolve going forward. But the one thing we do know is about changing culture. It needs a movement, not just to be told we're going to do it this way. Really get on board if we do want to change the world as far as how it operates, and start to think about all of this autonomous working, distributed workforces, being connected anywhere in the world at any time. It really does require a top and a bottom, kind of a top down, bottom up culture shift, and it's all about spirit of cooperation. So there is an immense amount of opportunity. Winston Churchill once said that don't let a good crisis go to waste, and we're very keen, hopefully from what you've just learned from this data, to share some insights on how that may impact you going forward as an organisation. Thank you very much for your time today. I will hand back over.
Well, thank you, Hannah, for this very interesting presentation. It's interesting to see how things have evolved and are still evolving the coming months. Thank you all participants for joining. We will send you a thank you note, including a link, so you can rerun this webinar again, also perhaps for colleagues who didn't have the time this afternoon to watch the webinar. And there will also be an opportunity to download Hannah's presentation. If you would like to learn more about Target's research and webinars, please visit thegreatindoors.eu. Apologies again for the delay. It was a bit early this morning on this side of the world, but we hope to see you again in a few weeks when we start another series of the Rethinking Workplace webinars. Thank you.